Welcome, everybody. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Prior to the colonizers arriving in this area, the indigenous land of what would later be called Multnomah County was home to many tribal peoples. We honor the indigenous peoples on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand: the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watalala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and recognize that we are here because of them. We honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Hi, everybody. My name is Sepide Bajracharya. I am a medical anthropologist and I teach in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Our panel today is titled Biomedicine, Identity, and the Body. And we have with us three wonderful panelists: Luca Sachs, he, they; Audrey Barrett, she, her; and Zoe Norling, they, them. So before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that your video and audio function will remain muted during the presentations. We're going to ask you to withhold your questions. I'll introduce the speakers and the title to their presentations. And then we ask you to withhold your questions until after the presentations, at which point we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for discussion. And we'll ask you to raise your Zoom hands if you'd like to address any of the speakers, at which point I'll call on you and you will be unmuted. You will be unmuted. But you don't have to wait till the end to ask your questions. So in the meantime, if any questions do arise and come for you, you may send them privately to Phoenix, who is our co-chair, a symposium co-chair. And she and I will go back and forth between your Zoom hands and the questions that you have sent her in the course of the presentations. So we're going to be using the Zoom auto captioning, which you guys can access at the bottom of your screens. And I'd like to remind everyone that we are recording this session and that recordings beyond that are not authorized. And we ask you to be sensitive to referring to our speakers with the correct pronouns. So in your experience, if you experience any problems at any point, you can send a chat message also directly to the host. So without further ado, I would like to begin, and I'd like to begin with our first presenter, Luca Sachs, he, they, and the title of his talk is Illuminating, well, let me introduce Luca first. Luca is a junior biochemistry, molecular biology, and international affairs major at Lewis and Clark College, who is passionate about equity work and scientific research. Besides his academic work, he also serves on the advisory committee for the Dean of Students and as a leader organizer for the Gender Minorities in STEM Club and the Queer Student Union on campus, where he works on outreach and accessibility and organizes the weekly support group for transgender and gender questioning students. Luca's talk today, presentation, is titled Illuminating the Intersection of Socioeconomic Status and Transgender Identities in Medical Emergencies. So I ask you all to welcome Luca.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today. And thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as Sepide just told you all, my presentation today is called illuminating the intersection of socioeconomic status and transgender identities in medical emergencies. So before I dive into my presentation, I want to give you a little overview of what this is going to look like. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own background. Then I will go into some of the important definitions and the frameworks that they come from. And then I will delve into my research findings and conclusions. And what I want to highlight is that you please feel free to step out at any time and take care of your own needs, because that's the most important. So here are some content warnings for my presentation. There will be some mentions of transphobia, racism, anxiety in medical procedures without any details. So if any of those are distressing to you at any point, feel free to step out and take a break. And I will also be giving content warnings at the beginning of slides when those specifically come up. So a bit of background information. I'm a junior at Lewis and Clark. I'm a biochemistry international affairs double major. And the research that I'm presenting to you is actually from my first year here from my exploration and discovery class. So bear with me. It's been a little while since I last talked about this, but I'm very excited to get back into it. I also want to highlight that, especially when doing research about communities that are marginalized by society, it's important to know the researcher's background. And so for me, I'm trans, I'm disabled, and I come from a financially unstable family, and I'm white and I'm European. So that's just hopefully allows you to contextualize my research and myself within that framework. And then my research is also focused on US and Canada predominantly, and that is due to a lack of data that from other regions. So bear that in mind. So I want to start with some key definitions. So what is transgender identity? What does that mean? So gender identity differs from sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned at birth is just a doctor thinking about genitals and deciding something, and that can be wrong sometimes. And gender identity is sort of your innate felt sense and experience with gender, and that both of these things can differ. And a lot of people for whom that is the case, they identify as trans. However, if you ask multiple trans people what they understand of their trans identities, you might get a variety of answers. So there are individual understandings of what being trans means. And then I also want to stress that being trans is an identity and it's an experience and it's not an opinion, meaning that you cannot question its validity. The other key definition that you need to know for my presentation is socioeconomic status. And the APA defines that as a combination of education, income, and occupation that give you access to resources, privilege, power, and control, both individually and structurally. So to know a little bit more broadly, the experience of trans people in the social sciences is pretty important to know. So in the past, trans people have been heavily pathologized with sort of a medical and psychiatric view in the social sciences. There was little to no contribution from actual trans people because that was neither allowed nor encouraged or possible. And that sort of created this really harmful narrative. And that's shifted a little bit in the present time where there's a little bit more an active participation in research of trans people about trans people. It tends to be a little more intersectional as well and more concerned with social justice. However, here I included sometimes because this is not always the case. So the framework that I'm doing this research in is intersectionality, and Black critical race theory scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw first coined that term. And she said that ethnicity, race, and gender influence the experiences of Black women in society. And in that way that it is necessary to examine power, discrimination, and privilege structurally and individually. And the other framework that I adopted for my research is social determinants of health. And it basically means that health is shaped by the social and political milieu that a person finds themselves in, and shaped by their identities as well. And that results in a variety of health disparities between different groups. And there can be worse health outcomes due to persistent discrimination. So first, I'm going to look at socioeconomic status separately, and then trans identities separately, and then I will look at the intersection of both of them. So when we're looking at socioeconomic status and healthcare, we find that there's a lack of accessible primary care, and that really is problematic because it increases emergency care use, and meaning that poor people, houseless people often rely on emergency care only. However, when they do go in and seek emergency care, they're confronted with the heavy stigma surrounding poverty in medicine, and that often results in worse quality of care and more untreated conditions, which then in return means that there are poor people and houseless people who have to seek more emergency care because they again can't access primary care. And that creates this vicious cycle of the experience of poor and houseless people within medical emergency services. So here I have a quote from one of the participants in my study, and I wanted to give a content warning for anxiety here. So this participant said, I had a panic attack and the bill for the emergency room was outrageous. Getting affordable healthcare in the US is hard, and now I refuse to go to the emergency room unless my limbs are literally falling off. And I think what that highlights is just the sheer inaccessibility of medical care due to its cost, at least in the United States. So when we're looking at trans identities separately, estimates show that about 0.3 to 3.2% of the population is trans. However, that's often questioned as a statistic, and people think that that percentage is actually higher. And trans identity is a social determinant of health that is often really under-researched because there aren't enough people who are trans who have more experience with trans people going into research looking at that. And what that results in often is institutional and informational erasure. And a study by Bauer et al. From 2009 showed that institutional erasure usually is characterized by an institution's inability to deal with the existence of trans people, meaning that, for example, hospitals might have gender-separated floors that don't work for non-binary patients, or they might not have places in their intake forms to indicate pronouns. And at the same time, there's also informational erasure, which the researchers define as in a lack of information around the experiences of trans people that result in healthcare practitioners not being aware. So other studies have found that about 92% of cis people are content with the emergency care that they receive, in contrast to only 50% of trans people. And the other 50% of trans people have had actually negative experiences in emergency care, and 21% of trans people have avoided using emergency care altogether. And that shows us the stark difference between the experience of cis people and the experience of trans people and emergency care. Um, and here are two participant statements from two participants of my study, and there's a content warning for transphobia. So one of them said, in the past, I was called an it and interrogated about my sex when it wasn't relevant. For this reason, I did not want to go to the ER. And the other one said, I was treated with proper care when I arrived. They gendered me correctly and did not ask invasive questions. This was a positive experience compared to the non-emergency healthcare I have received. And I'm grateful that I was treated with respect in a time of vulnerability. And I think both of those highlight how there is quite an intense difference in how certain medical professionals and certain health systems allow for the existence of trans people within their systems. And especially when people are seeking emergency care, they are extremely vulnerable. and their identities matter even more than maybe in sort of regular healthcare settings. So here comes the intersection part of my actual presentation. So studies have shown that trans people are twice as likely to be unemployed as cis people, and about 15% of trans people earn $10,000 or less and thus live in extreme poverty, and that's in the United States. And on average, trans people are more educated than the average US American, but make about 40% less money than their cisgender counterparts with the same education. So we see that often a person's trans identity can influence the type of socioeconomic status that they have, and the types of access that someone has to financial resources in order to fund their emergency medical care, or to access it overall. However, it's really important to note here that the rates for unemployment, for example, are significantly higher for Black, Indigenous, and other trans people of color, and for disabled trans people. And the marginalization of all of these identities increases the overall discrimination that a person experiences in emergency care and can decrease the quality of care significantly. So if I was to do this study again, I would include more questions about the experiences of Black and Indigenous and other people of color and disabled trans people. And overall, that often leads to more chronic health concerns. So what are some improvements that could make the situation better? So here I've added some ideas for the patient-provider interaction. And the first one is respect. You would think that that's a given, but apparently it's not. The second one is inclusion in medical training. It's an issue that the inclusion of marginalized voices in medical training material, in training facilities has been very little. And so that is something that could be increased in order to increase the sensitivity of the provider for the experiences of marginalized people in their care. And that also raises the awareness of the providers, and hopefully other societal awareness around these topics will help providers learn more. There are also some ideas for the patient system interaction. And the first one is administrative awareness. So that's tackling the institutional and informational erasure that I touched on briefly earlier. And on sort of the basis of that is creating a more equitable healthcare and insurance system than the one that is currently present in the United States. So the conclusions that I have from my research are that the society's perception of marginalized groups affect the healthcare and their health and their healthcare that's provided to them. However, individual healthcare systems, for example, not within the United States or Canada, might have other individual problems and might need other individual solutions. So there's no like one solution for all. But I think societies and the medical field's awareness around this is slowly increasing, and hopefully that will lead to change. And hopefully people who are going into the medical field or the public health field will really adopt an intersectional lens of looking at the experiences of the people they deal with. This is a little different from my topic specifically, but I wanted to touch on this too because currently there are a lot of anti-trans bills that are on the floor at the moment, and I would like to highlight those and as a call to action. So for example, the Missouri bill HB 33 prohibits any gender-related healthcare for trans people under the age of 18 and revokes medical licensing of any healthcare professionals who are involved with it. The Florida bill S2012 prohibits trans girls from playing on girls' teams in high schools. And the Montana bill SB 245 allows healthcare professionals to discriminate against trans people based on their faith. And so If you care about the experiences of trans people in healthcare, in sports, in their everyday lives, um, and especially the experiences of trans people with other marginalized identities, such as poor trans people, disabled trans people, Black trans people, please, please use your agency, use your voice, contact your legislators, support the local communities that are doing incredible work to fight all of these bills, and raise your voice because listening and thinking about presentations is one thing, getting to action and doing something is the other. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Luca. So our next presenter is Audrey Barrett, she, her. And Audrey is a senior SOAN major and art minor at Lewis and Clark. She grew up in Aurora, Colorado, and has always loved to read and write. During her time at Lewis and Clark, she has written about gender, eating disorders, and sexuality. In past research, she has explored the dimensions of female sexuality in college, the moral panic around abortion and contraception, empowerment and degradation in music videos by female rappers, and the role of biomedicine in the illness experience of bulimia. Through creative writing, she delves into some of these same topics, including her personal experience with eating disorders, mental illness, and sexuality. She is interested in learning and writing about embodiment within and outside structures of power and the way embodiment can be a form of resistance. Audrey is passionate about amplifying the voices of those who have often been silenced or misrepresented, which is the aim of her thesis. So Audrey's talk today, presentation, is titled Narrating Eating Disorders, Illness and Healing in the Context of American Culture and Biomedicine. So Audrey.
Thank you, Sepide. Let me share my screen. All right, so as Sepide told you all, today I'm going to be presenting the research I did last summer and fall for my sociology and anthropology thesis. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that this topic may be difficult for some individuals. While I won't be specifically describing eating disorder behaviors, I will be talking about people's experience of the causes of eating disorders and their struggles with recovery, including mentions of mental health issues, trauma, and marginalization under oppressive structures of power. So I just ask everyone to check in with where they are today and take care of themselves as needed. So this research was inspired by my time in treatment for my eating disorder, and I connected with a lot of great people there who really got what I was going through. And I realized part of what makes these illnesses so difficult is the misunderstanding and stigma that surrounds them. My peers could relate to the struggle of family and friends not understanding what we were going through, of them telling us things like, just eat and it'll be okay. And so I wanted to go into that and examine our resentment of the way that eating disorders are represented in the popular media. And sorry, something weird is happening on my screen, and I don't know if y'all can see that, but I'm gonna try to fix it really quickly. My email likes to open itself. Sorry. Okay, so we're back. So anyway, I just wanted to look into that and kind of get the knowledge that I was finding from these people that I had met in treatment and spread that with other people, because it really taught me that recovery is not about gaining weight. It's about coming to terms with the traumas that caused the eating disorder in the first place and searching for a sense of self beyond the illness. So as I've said, in this research, I want to work against those social misconceptions about eating disorders that influence both biomedical approaches and how people who have eating disorders think about themselves and their experience. The image that you see on the slide right now is super problematic. It's what comes up when you Google eating disorders, and it reflects the harmful stereotype that eating disorders only affect extremely thin, white, upper to middle class young women who are obsessed with their appearance or the size of their waist. Early eating disorder scholarship from like the 1970s and 80s contributed to this gendered, raced, and classed portrait of eating disorders that persists in the popular imagination today. But many people outside this demographic are affected by eating disorders, and these misconceptions lead to biases in diagnosis and treatment. Eating disorders in women of color, men, and people who aren't extremely thin are underdiagnosed because they are so often overlooked or invalidated by doctors. Also, the idea that eating disorders are a vain, irrational pursuit of thinness hides the deeper psychological, interpersonal, and societal factors that are at play. And lastly, the biomedical definition of illness in Western society, based on bodily function and behavior, overlooks dimensions of illness and healing that extend beyond the body. So I found in my research that eating disorders are complex psychological, emotional, and societal illnesses. They can affect any demographic, and many systems of oppression can contribute to the felt disempowerment that can lead to an eating disorder. Because the disorder is a coping mechanism that helps people cope with those experiences of marginalization and trauma. So while it is about losing weight, it is more so about taking back the control over your marginalized body and creating a sense of agency and empowerment within that. So an eating disorder is about more than the body. It is connected to a person's entire experience within their social, interpersonal, and cultural context. And that includes, societal body ideals or interpersonal relationships or past experiences of trauma. Healing is about way more than weight gain or stabilization of vitals. It's about learning to cope with those difficult life experiences in a more constructive way. The idea that people are recovered once their bodies are healthy invalidates their continued struggles and suffering, because this pain doesn't always show up physiologically. I use the concept of illness narratives in my research because it spotlights the unique knowledge of firsthand experience, which aligns with my bigger goal of giving voice to that which has been silenced. Arthur Frank asserts that illness narratives have potential as a pedagogy of suffering, which for me means that illness narratives has something to teach us about the illness itself and also about the meaning of illness within society and for that individual's life narrative. In existing eating disorders research, much of it focuses on disease etiology, physiological outcomes of clinical treatment, or therapeutic methods. And a lot of that is biased towards the demographic that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and also operates under the assumption that eating disorders are an illness of the body. There is more happening in an eating disorder than even physiological or psychological medication type remedies can fix. So I find that these illness narratives shed light on what is happening beyond the body and allow for a greater diversity of voices and experiences. I hope that these stories will point to more effective ways of understanding and treating eating disorders and serve to humanize the stigmatized and romanticized individuals who struggle with them. For this research, I interviewed 9 people who were my peers in eating disorders treatment in the summer of 2020. I used a semi-structured interview because it allowed for organic conversations while also providing a consistent narrative context. My existing relationship with interlocutors as peer and friend allowed for more comfortable conversations and kind of served to mitigate the awkwardness that might go along with talking about your eating disorder to someone who doesn't get it. The peer relationship also kind of equalizes the hierarchical format of the interview, and I found that led to really productive conversations that were mutually informative and even therapeutic. So regarding my sample, while the composition was demographically varied, it still only represents a population which did receive institutional care. So my research has these biases in terms of who has access to care and whose disorder is seen as legitimate by biomedical and cultural authorities. 6 of the 9 participants identified as white, 7 of 9 identified as women, and 6 of 9 were on the younger side between the ages of 18 and 22. All participants had the time and money or applicable insurance, because many insurance policies don't cover eating disorders treatment, so that they could go to this high-level treatment. None of my interlocutors identify as Black or Indigenous, and to my knowledge, there wasn't anyone in the treatment center at the time I was there who identified as such. But according to the National Eating Disorders Association, eating disorders do affect Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, queer people, and economically disadvantaged people at similar rates to privileged white women. The difference is that those historically marginalized groups get help at significantly lower rates. So while this study is limited in its demography in that it only includes one man, one genderqueer person, and 3 people of color, this limitation demonstrates the acuity of the problem that social and medical misconceptions have created and shows the discrepancies in access to care. So kind of going into the content of what I discussed in my thesis, one key finding was that eating disorders are a coping mechanism to deal with experiences of marginalization and trauma. I argue that this is a function that this is something that both reifies the societal order in that it capitulates to sort of that thin ideal, but at the same time, it is a site of agency and psychological self-preservation. One interlocutor, who I call Willow, described how their eating disorder helped them survive childhood abuse and the lifelong repercussions of trauma. Even though the disease almost killed them, they said they are grateful to have had the eating disorder as a psychological survival strategy. They said, in many ways, it saved our life. Coming from the background that we have and the world we lived in as a child and then as an adult, the eating disorder was our friend. So the illness as a coping mechanism actually was beneficial in Willow's perspective because it helped them get through these difficult life situations. It also helps them feel safer in their gender. Their experiences taught them that being a girl is vulnerable, and they identify as gender fluid. So being in a body that has those feminine curves is really uncomfortable. Losing weight made them appear less normatively feminine and was therefore safer, both in terms of gender dysphoria and coping with past traumas. Another interlocutor, who I call Mira, identifies as Asian American. Her eating disorder helped her cope with feelings of ambiguity and outsiderness in her racial identity. She said, "My identity became kind of like skinny Mira, but I was okay with it because I wanted to stand out in a good way and not because I'm brown. Growing up, I never felt like I was Indian enough or American enough. I guess when I'm trying to find my eating disorder, trying to find my identity outside of the eating disorder, it goes back to that question, which is really difficult to answer." Mira deflects attention from her feelings of racial ambiguity and her brownness by redefining herself in terms of her thinness, which for her is a way of coping with the marginalization she experiences under white supremacy. Her body is thus a site of agency where her eating disorder can help alleviate deeper insecurities about her position in society. For both Willow and Mira, the eating disorder was a means of making themselves safe in a society that threatened their very existence. Aligning with Becky Wingsgard Thompson, I argue that systems of oppression, including but also beyond the patriarchy, are a cause of eating disorders. I also argue that eating disorders are a crystallization of culture, as Susan Bordo puts it. Disordered eating is actually a rational response to the moralized body ideals in modern society and is a way for marginalized or traumatized people to gain social and psychological capital. I also want to draw attention to the way that Malson and Burns put it, which is this slash in disordered eating to sort of underscore the way that disordered eating cooperates with the normalizing gaze of society. So because people use eating disorders to cope with trauma or feelings of inadequacy, letting go of that destructive behavior is a lot harder than it seems. Just as Mira said, when she tries to find her identity outside of the eating disorder, she comes back to that way more difficult question of her racial identity. Another interlocutor questioned whether she was anything more than her eating disorder. She said, "If not, I might as well just live it out and be it." And in Willow's case, they had an eating disorder for 41 years before they even realized that's what it was. And so when it becomes so ingrained with daily life like this, it can be really hard to see that it's actually something that's dangerous and something that you need to get help with. This makes it hard for people to recognize they are ill. And then the definitions of eating disorders, both culturally and medically, make it even harder for people to really resonate with that diagnosis and realize that they need to get some help. And so in Willow's case, when they were diagnosed, they were in denial. They said, "We thought the doctors were full of shit. And even still to this day, we think they're full of shit." It doesn't help to feel that way when you get very sick, and yet you're still willing to deny it. For Willow and for others, feeling not sick enough to deserve care was a psychological barrier that kept them sicker for longer. Even though less than 6% of people with eating disorders are medically classified as underweight, the DSM-4 defined anorexia in terms of a specific body weight. And while the DSM-5 is a little bit better, and it has dropped the requirement that someone lose their period, which obviously excludes people who don't menstruate, That kind of conception from that DSM-4 definition persists today and is a barrier to both people being diagnosed and accepting their own illnesses. For example, in Willow's case, they have atypical anorexia because they don't meet that body weight requirement, even though they literally needed to be in the hospital where passing out required a pacemaker. And so it's clear that they were sick without meeting these biomedical and social definitions of disordered eating. And so what I found was that people kind of need to recognize the eating disorder as other, come to process that and build an identity outside of it, and then also integrate that illness experience into a coherent narrative of self. In Riley's case, she realizes that her eating disorder is actually something that made her stronger. So integrating this into her life narrative in a constructive way helps her cope with the damage the illness has done, even when she feels doubtful that the eating disorder thoughts will ever go away. She sees recovery as a continuous and unstable process. She said, "I think you're always fighting the eating disorder and always going through it. I can't even tell you how many times after leaving treatment, I've thought about just saying fuck it and going back to it. So I find that recovery is a mindset of every second of every day, continuing to choose to do it. Because these illnesses are so chronic, because they are used as a very effective coping mechanism, many people with eating disorders slip, relapse, and end up back in treatment before they find lasting healing, if they do at all. And the dangerous chronicity of eating disorders is one of the reasons they are the second deadliest mental illness, second only to opioid overdose. Riley, for example, has been struggling with an eating disorder since she was 5, and she has been to treatment 3 times, but she's still here. And through this exhausting fight, she finds motivation in narratives of her eating disorder as destructive. She remembers that it could kill her and prevent her from being there for her friends and family. She dreams of someday being a mom and a lawyer, and she realizes how the eating disorder could make her infertile and inhibits her mental functioning. Through these narratives, along with the narrative that her struggle makes her stronger, she is motivated to continue choosing recovery in every second of every day, even when it feels overwhelmingly difficult. And so people kind of end up in this in-between space where they're not really healthy and they're not really sick. And this is something that was the most interesting finding for me, and one that really resonated, was that healing is a continuous process. Many people doubted whether their eating disorder would ever really go away, even if they learned how to cope with it and stay healthy. One interlocutor, Alicia, expressed the ambiguity of healing when she said, "I'm not in recovery. I'm moving toward recovery, but I don't feel like I have anorexia." She doesn't fully inhabit illness or wellness. I argue that recovery is a space of affective excess, in that people exist somewhere between illness and health. Ben Anderson defines the affective excess as that which is not bounded by discourses of power, and therefore has the potential to transcend them. In the process of recovery, it's not really described by any of these biomedical or cultural binaries that we have created about illness and health. One interlocutor, Eileen, I think put it really beautifully when she said that recovery is a lifelong road of turns with no real destination. As long as I'm progressing in some way, even if I go back now and again and I relapse, as long as I'm going forward, that's recovery for me. She redefines healing not as absence of disease, but as a mindset and a compassionate manner of treating herself, even when she slips and seems to move backwards. The way eating disorder recovery blurs the lines between illness and healing defies biomedical conceptions of illness and creates a liminal space for contradiction, nonlinearity, and process. The specific experience of an eating disorder is shaped by and shapes one's life course. It is not eradicated through specific treatment like many other diseases are, but has to be lived through and narratively integrated. Existing in this space alongside my interlocutors has allowed me to accept the presence of multiple truths, to understand that growth sometimes looks like mistakes, and to have compassion for myself, even when my healing seems to move sideways or backwards. In recovery, all movement is progress. Thank you.
Audrey, thank you. So our next presentation is by Zoe Norling. Zoe is a senior sociology anthropology major and political economy minor at Lewis and Clark College. They are passionate about community organizing, accessible knowledge, and trans non-binary and gender non-conforming identity awareness. Through Lewis and Clark, they have volunteered with the Gender Symposium in the past and presented on Ecuadorian sex worker activist tactics at the symposium in spring 2019. They have been a club leader for the magazine The Collective, which also worked with the Gender Symposium. So Zoe's presentation is titled Questioning Embodiment, a trans analysis of the potentiality of the felt sense. So Zoe.
All right. Thank you all for being here today. I wanted to thank Phoenix and Kendall and Kim specifically for putting together this symposium and for holding space for all the speakers. I wanted to give a quick content warning for this presentation. I will be discussing symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, depression, depersonalization, and derealization disorder. I'll be discussing feelings of the body. Please feel free to mute me, to shut your computer, or take a beat if at any point during this presentation you feel the need to. So for now, I ask that you allow yourself to be here after listening to these wonderful speakers. However your body would like to show up, let it. Do what you need to do right now to get as comfortable as you can. Try to breathe, care not to judge your breath. However it is here. Thank you for joining us today. Your presence is held here in whatever way it can be by those in our space. If emotions show up again, drop them if you must, hold them if you must, exit the space, return, close your cameras, close your door to breathe. Whatever way you can be here and present, I thank you. So a bit about this work. I came to it personally about 3 to 4 years ago after diagnoses of severe depersonalization, derealization, neurocardiogenic syncope disorder, as well as anxiety, depression, PTSD. And I started this research more formally about almost a year now for my thesis. So this is my thesis statement, which is that I argue that therapy is an environment that is charged with emotion, yet conducted through an economic exchange between therapist and client. Although therapy is an area arranged by money, there are moments of emotional vulnerability between a therapist and client that are defined through an anti-capitalist or government or biopolitical state mindset. I argue that it is in these emotionally effective economic encounters that new ways in which to conceptualize embodiment, such as the felt sense, are self-discovered. The felt sense, thus, is a linguistic tool to describe embodiment and identity formation in connection to state social orders. I argue that the definition of the felt sense fills gaps in feminist and queer theory and further defines affect theory to include how the self, others, society, and the space between these actors creates new subjectivities and identities that are intrinsically tied to, yet in opposition of United States capitalist society and gender binaries. So what is the felt sense? The felt sense, as what Levine describes it, is the vehicle through which we experience ourselves as organisms. Levine is one of the first people in a Western psychotherapy sense to document the felt sense. I would like to offer here a large critique of Levine, who uses the biopolitical model of medicine, where there's an end goal whereby following steps to access the felt sense, one might become healed, might be able to get better. Pain holds a space, it tells us something, and it is held with care. Sometimes these things will not be fixed, or rather, are not something to be fixed at all. In my experience as a trans person during my transition, Levine's words on the felt sense helped me to reimagine presence outside of the way in which it was taught to me in my Midwest Western society. However, I did not take it to be that my disassociation, PTSD, DPDR diagnosis was something to be fixed. Rather, it was something to start a conversation with. Among therapists who are also queer, this conversation is able to be held in silence and care with the other person being practiced present. Levine puts non-Western practices, which are especially present in Indigenous and Southeast Asian ways of being, of sensory presence, into Western end goal-oriented terminology. For that, he reaches those that do not know otherwise. However, he still places these beings on a path to the ultimate healed or enlightened human. So Levine begins to describe trauma through animalistic behaviors, which humans inherently have. When in a possible traumatic experience, our bodies respond in 3 ways: fight, flight, or freeze. Levine focuses on the traumatic aspects of freezing, such as when a deer is caught in the headlights and cannot move. Freezing in humans might look like disassociation, disconnection to a body. When a person cannot help but freeze in the face of trauma, the emotions that would have otherwise been released to the body through the act of fight or flight are trapped. This results in increased trauma symptoms, particularly showcased in the body. Levine uses knowledge from the animal world and the felt sense to guide readers through exercises which release this trapped energy by noticing the sensations through the felt sense, sitting with them, and then releasing them. So I argue with authors such as Levine that the very matter of a body is living, and it speaks to us in a way which we could hear more clearly if we were not routinely traumatized, controlled, and encouraged to disconnect from our bodies to participate in capitalism and gender binaries. So why the felt sense, the invisibility of pain? So Western and neoliberal notions of pain and the biopolitical model of care surround ideas of private and loneliness. It is goal-oriented. It is something which many people experience alone. In the United States biopolitical model, something which Stevenson describes is the regime of life, which loosely described is the way in which we are lumped together as one human entity of like United States citizen to become alive for the purpose of the state, for the purpose of the biopolitical mode of just being alive, to be alive, to live in the US. Stevenson also describes anonymous care, which is loosely described as neoliberal care. It shows up in ways which come from the state disguised as care, but are actually harmful and further modes in which we are not able to listen to our bodies. So again, why the felt sense? It is a new or alternative form of care. So this is from Christina Crosby, who suffered from a bike accident and became quadriplegic. Because of my condition, I've been pondering the reality that everybody is a body. Your body emerges through the perception of others as different from yourself at a touchable distance, and selfhood is not contained. What you want, who you are, how you feel are all brought into being over time and in relation to others. And those thoughts and feelings are repeatedly inscribed, creating powerful circuits that organize a sense of embodied self. Such is human interdependency that my self-regard depends on your regard for me. I need and want a more fully livable life, which turns importantly, if not exclusively, on this play of recognition. So what I admire about this quote from Crosby is her aspects of human interdependency and how we are all affected by other people and affect other people, which creates our beings. Another quote to further this point is from Sarah Ahmed in regards to responding to pain and an ethic of responding to pain. Ahmed says, an ethics of responding to pain involves being open to being affected by that which one cannot know or feel. It is my pain that becomes uncertain. The ungraspability of her pain calls me back to my body, even when it is not in pain, to feel it, to explore its surfaces, to inhabit it. In other words, the ungraspability of my own pain is brought to the surface by the ungraspability of the pain of others. This is not a radical egoism. Rather, in the face of the otherness of my own pain, I am undone before her and for her. So this quote, which I'm trying to connect here to the felt sense, is how everybody lives in their own pains, and by being next to, in the realm of therapy, the pain of someone else, therapists are also affected by that pain. And so in this research, I explore how this affectness of therapist to other queer client, how it remakes and undoes us. So for my methods, I collaborated through interviews with trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming therapists who work with trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming peoples. I also collaborated and interviewed trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming friends. The therapists which I interviewed were from Portland and were all white. My friends that I interviewed were of mixed background and races, and were not so much structured interviews, but free-flowing conversations. I interviewed my own therapist on the process of affecting and being affected by a client and what occurs in that space. My future work includes coding journals from kindergarten to present for linguistics used to describe extended DPDR symptoms. Generally, what I found in interviewing these therapists and friends is in sensorially being open to intimacy and changing each other, we are remade in new ways. So felt sense to describe how trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming peoples frame embodiment. This is a quote from a collaborator, which I will call Celosia, and this is their story. Content warning, it describes life, death, and survival in terms of transness. Celosia states, my cousin and I had this big talk where a big part of why he relapsed was because his girlfriend broke up with him because she found pictures of him cross-dressing. And he never told anyone about that before, and he told me. He came out to me and I came out to him. And then I had this moment where I was super thankful. My cousin is 32 years old and has been in rehab 4 times and has gone through it. Still drinks, he's just struggling, and he's trying to unlearn the shit, societal expectations of gender. That's also why it was so good to meet him and to both be like, okay, we're both trans. We're both trying to unwrite these horrible family inherited curses and demons. And at this moment, though, I was so thankful to be born in the body that I was born with, because if I wasn't, I'd probably be dead, just based on the long history of people born as men in my family and my own history with that, and how I literally have just skated by. I know it's because of that. So describing embodiment, Celosia's story describes how their cousin relapsed after their girlfriend broke up with them because they were trans. Celia described how multiple men in their family coped in life through addiction and how they have struggled with this as well. This is not to say that all people who struggle with addiction are queer, or that all queers are addicted to substances. Yet I believe there's a connection between bodily disconnection and using what is available for us to survive in a society with gender binaries. Something which Celosia and other interlocutors and collaborators talked about experiencing. Celosia states that they were grateful to be born in the body that they were in that moment, counteracting a lifelong struggle of feeling out of place in one's skin, because if they had been born another, assigned male at birth, they worry they would have had a harder or longer time coming to terms with their trans identity. Possibly, I will state, due to our society's ingrained patriarchal notion that men must not share or be in tune with their emotions, which is a pivotal aspect of embodiment. Therefore, Celosia is deconstructing how if they had been assigned male at birth, they still feel as though they would identify with a trans identity and consciousness, yet would have had a harder time coming to terms with these internal emotions, thus having a harder time connecting to their body, and would be dead, since they already have literally just skated by. In a moment where Celosia accessed the felt sense, they're able to analyze society's impact on their body, the unique family history of methods of survival, and their own growth, even after a lifelong struggle with feeling the felt sense and embodiment. So potentially of the felt sense for theory. So Butler and Sedgwick, which are two very well-known and very influential theorists for queer theory, who I do admire, they position trans identities who choose not to go sex reassignment surgery as more radical for not ascribing to the gender binary and thus lack social and political awareness for the difficulties of gender dysphoria and the lived experience of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming peoples who feel more comfortable surgically transitioning. Butler and Sedgwick also ascribe to the passing and continuum model, which oversimplifies gender dysphoria and bodily discomfort as something that can be solved by transitioning or behaving one certain way. I will also critique the continuum model, the statement that gender is a fluid sliding scale, as I believe this model doesn't account for the importance of differences or uniqueness of treatment for specific bodies with specific intersections and identities rather than others. So why the felt sense? The felt sense is a way in which trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming peoples and people in general can describe how binary societal experiences of gender cause physical harm to the body through the form of anxiety or discomfort surrounding certain gendered body parts. The felt sense also describes positive moments where trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming peoples feel happy to be alive in a body, even while struggling with feeling embodied or attached to their bodies at all. So I will be wrapping up here shortly. First, talking about the economy interaction in a moment of therapy and the elitism in psychotherapy. So one of my collaborators, Sasha, says, my actual values around liberation and collective emancipation and anti-capitalism is very difficult for me to also be in my professional role with all of the complex political meanings that even the word professional can conjure up. In quote one, this showcases how Sasha is contending with the commodification of emotion in the occupation of therapy. Although therapy inherently commodifies emotions and therapists must control their feelings in some states, I argue that the felt sense is an example of how effective economies can be a site of community building, identity formation, whereas two identities are undone and remade in a moment where both are open to being affected and to affect the other. Let's see. Sasha also says that if it weren't for oppressive social conditions, I honestly don't think I would have a lot of need to be doing gender-focused therapy. And Hawks, another one of my collaborators, says, and over time in my work, I was experiencing so much burnout and so much anxiety. And I was like, I need to figure out how to deal with this. I just need to think of a way to release those burnout emotions from my body. So Richard and Runacek state that affect is more than just emotions, and by positioning emotions as solely an inner state of being, we miss out on the highlighting relationships between two subjective experiences, social orders, and identities. Therefore, I believe that Richard and Runacek would appreciate the felt sense as an approach to understanding affect and economic exchanges to produce identities, because we see how the felt sense is used to describe individual emotions in connection to broader social orders, such as by Sasha's first and second quotes. Richard and Runacek state that affect is enacted through powerful embodied practices, as well as discourse, and are interested not so much in what structures feeling, but rather in what feeling structures. In Sasha's quote, they begin to discuss how the state structures feeling. In Hawks's quote, we begin to see that the felt sense is a tool to describe what feeling structures. In therapy, Hawks discusses how they feel burned out and how through the felt sense, they're able to feel more connected by listening to their body. Hawks was able to restructure how the stress of life shows up in their own body, and thus were able to better navigate exchanges between themselves and with a queer client, showcasing how in a moment of economic exchange, the identities of the therapist and trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming client were undone and reframed and formed. Affect, the felt sense, and emotions could all be manipulated by the state to exert control, and that still appears in therapy as interlocutors describe how they must control some of their emotions, and that there wouldn't even need to be psychotherapy, if not for oppressive social orders. However, the felt sense as a way to describe affect is something that is tied to, but not explicitly defined by individual emotions and connects the individual to other subjects and social orders in a way that wishes to possibly deconstruct these connections and ties from our body to the state. So in conclusion, felt sense is a resource for knowledge. It can be a tool to listen to built up bodily trauma and locate your pain, care in the self. It's a way to describe embodiment, which fills some limits in feminist and queer theory. And it connects the self to broader societal structures and government control, a way to describe affect, how you affect me, how I affect you, and how we can all affect each other. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite all the presenters to present themselves. We have about 10 minutes or so, a little bit over 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So I ask you to raise your Zoom hands and I will call on you in the order that I perceive you. And also then might also ask Phoenix to kind of jump in. So are there any questions for all of our presenters?
We do have one question kind of about what comes next for all of the presenters of now that you've done the research and in some capacity finished the project to a point where you can present it. What's the next step?
Do any of you want to go in particular? So Luca, perhaps you'll go first.
Yeah, sure. So what's next? That's a good question. It's hard. I think for me, I wanted to be able to present this, and I was supposed to present this actually last year at the Gender Studies Symposium, but the panel that I was on the day that got canceled because of COVID. And I think for me, it's important to spread this information, particularly with people who are thinking about going into healthcare fields or public health. And I've been trying to do that in my classes and through this presentation in order to raise awareness there. But I do acknowledge that just purely doing research and not taking any concrete action afterwards isn't ideal. And I think academia does that a lot, but it's not actually that helpful for society. So I'm looking into integrating this into some of the other community work that I'm doing outside.
Thank you, Luca. Audrey, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of what's next is more internal and within my own immediate relational world, just working on my own healing. Things have gone up and down and all around just since submitting my thesis. And it's also really important to me to stay connected to those interlocutors and that support system, and just lifting each other up and trying to find other ways to make this community more visible and stronger.
Thank you. Zoe?
Yeah. I think for me, starting this research really changed how I move in life and how I orient myself in the world, which I'm really appreciative of, but it's definitely been painful at times. I think that for me, that's what I hope to continue doing, is to find ways to bring this into myself and how I interact with others. But I think researchally speaking, I'm going to continue to try adding more personal accounts to this. I think for my official thesis, I veered away from that. And so in the future, I think I hope to try and do that. Reaching out to other grad students that are working on some similar projects has been recently something I've been doing, and possibly pursuing this as a career option, some sort of anthropology, biomedicine, community healing and care in a very direct way is kind of what's interesting me right now with these topics. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, I have a question. I have a question for all of you that actually just continues in this line of conversation, because all of you are speaking to how it is that the personal is kind of connecting for you guys with the collective, and how the personal is connecting for you with how you make sense, right, of this experience. So there's that experiential sort of component to it. So I'd love to kind of hear perhaps a little bit more, continuing on sort of what the research, the relationship between what you're going through personally and what you have come to understand is a collective experience. So if you could say a little bit about how your personal has come to kind of interact with the collective, because I think that one thing that kind of highlighted for me in your presentations was how isolating the experience, of this experience is. And how there is kind of a relationship to others. And I think the research process has very much kind of brought you into a point where you are, actively interacting with people. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how that process has been for you, and how that continues to kind of affect your life. And also there, perhaps, if you could speak to how it is that the process and the demands of a thesis and writing a paper that asks that you kind of like make sense of the personal, how that has, what your relationship to that has been. So you can choose to answer whichever aspect of that you may want, but yeah.
Start again if that works. And I relate very much to what Zoe was saying earlier about it being hard at times. Like, it was definitely hard for me to read through other people's descriptions of their experiences in the medical system, because a lot of them resonated with me as like a trans disabled person who interacts with the medical system on a very frequent basis. It was hard, but I think it there I remember sort of the moment where I started connecting it to the broader picture, and connecting it to theories that exist, connecting it to communities that are out there, and identifying who some of the key players are in those communities, who some of the key activists are, really sort of gave me a sense of comfort and of reassurance and of validity, because I think since it is such an isolating experience sometimes when you're at the intersection of different identities, there's nothing more valuable than to have other people around you and a collective saying, like, we believe you, we understand what you're going through, you're valid. And those are experiences, I think, that have not just helped me sort of grow in terms of my academic work, but also just personally, and in the way that like I see the world. And it's changed my view on how I think I interact with my communities, and especially now during COVID, that's like heightened all of this in a whole different way again.
Thank you, Luca. Audrey?
Yeah, I think throughout this process, I've been just incredibly inspired by the people that I was working with. And while hearing their stories at times is absolutely heartbreaking, it is just such a deep level of connection that I am really grateful to have. And like, I find myself being inspired by their stories, and in putting like my entire soul and life into this thesis last fall, just feeling really connected to my authentic values, feeling motivated in my own recovery, wanting to maintain those relationships with the amazing people that I worked with, and sort of feeling this desire to embody what I write about and to actually kind of choose that path of healing, even when it's extremely difficult. And I think from an intellectual perspective, it's helpful to kind of connect the things that I have been through to larger societal systems, and to realize that, like, what do I value as a person? I don't want to support this disgusting body ideal that represents a lot of things that are wrong with society. And so it sort of helps me like be reminded of the reasons why I'm doing this.
Thank you, Audrey. Zoe?
Yeah, one thing that I really appreciated from my collaborators, I think it was specifically Sasha, who during one of our sessions was like, I can't stand talking about this so long because this is something that everyone experiences. Like every single person has difficulty like feeling embodied and finding themselves and you know, feeling connected to a body and sensorially like senses. Um, so in that way, my collaborators very specifically stated that this is a universal in some certain aspects just by being human. And I think in terms of like the individual, it is, you know, right, what Audrey and Luca were just stating is this idea of embodying theory and making theory personal. And, you know, in terms of community organizing, I do believe that it is in those daily and minute interactions with everybody that you see that like things start to be noticed. So I think bringing that to the different communities that I occupy and the different spaces that I show up in has been really meaningful. And I think in terms of like the trans and queer communities and spaces that I occupy, it has altered the meaning of care and pain for me, which has been really influential in healing and reimagining like society and space and the world, I suppose, you know, broadly speaking.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I really want to just extend my thanks and how moved and affected I have been by your presentations. And I would like to thank everybody in the audience as well for being so wonderful and for holding this collective space with us. Encourage you to attend as many more events as you can. Remind you of the virtual art gallery, and there's a presentation this evening, a performance. I think it's called The Secretaries at 7:30, and I encourage you to attend that as well. Goodbye and enjoy this incredible day as much as you may be able.